Hello, I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of Hyperion Cleantech Group and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Now, so far this year, 2023, there's been a lot of talk around nuclear fusion and some big advances in the US and in Europe, which we'll refer back to, because today I've got not one guest, but two. I've got Nick Hawker, who's the CEO, CTO and founder of First Light Fusion, alongside Robert Trezona, who is founding partner of Kiko Ventures, one of the main investors in First Light Fusion. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, Nick. Robert, great to have you with me on the Leaders in Cleantech podcast.
Hi, David. Great to be here again. Yeah, my pleasure.
Good to see you. As you say there, Robert, again, for those eagle-eyed or eagle listeners amongst us, you would know that Robert joined me on a podcast quite some time ago, actually, with a view on Deeptech. Investing generally. Robert's here today specifically as an investor in First Light Fusion, which is the company we're mostly going to be delving into. So that leads to an introduction to you, Nick. If you can perhaps share a little bit of, before we dive into the company, I think there are some nuances around starting a deep tech or a fusion company, but generally what was your path towards thinking, actually, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to create a company versus carrying on in some kind of academic capacity?
Yeah, so First Light spun out from my PhD research, which is I think a common thing in deep tech. There's a certain training need requirement sort of work with these hard topics. What specifically maybe think about starting a company for this? I'm during my PhD prop entrepreneur and sort of in commerce. So it's this guy from the US called Bob Dean, who's not around any longer, but he had started 13 companies during his life.
Right.
And a real sort of formative experience was actually going over to visit Bob and going to one of his companies. It was actually the second factory for this company that made plasma cutters.
Okay.
And every single beam in the entire factory had been cut with one of their own plasma torches, which was like super cool. So like seeing that example and seeing across the table from this person and sort of realizing, and I think like I think about how we get stuff done, So I genuinely think that if it wasn't for that example there during my PhD, I'm going to be here now.
Okay. It's always interesting, those little catalysts and events or conversations and sometimes small things which tip the balance that make you to the point of, hey, I can do this. Which leads a little bit onto the next question, Nick. Obviously, we've had, I think, upwards of 100 founders on the podcast to date, most of whom are involved in a technology where they have some commercial traction already. But jumping into something like fusion, where clearly there's a lot to be done before we're sort of fully commercialized, and we'll dive more into exactly that. But how do you think that alters your mindset and your ability to build a team around you when your goal is clearly massive and the impacts would be enormous, but equally it's not going to be happening overnight? How do you and your team cope with that?
Well, I think it's the sort of scale of ambition and the scale of impact that you can have, and I suppose I guess I see it pretty analogous to the financial aspect of investing in a company like this, to be honest, which is it's a long time, but the reward is potentially enormous. Yeah. And I kind of think the same thing. Investing my own time into this, I realize that it's a very long journey. But the potential impact is absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Another thing I would also say is that yes, we have people here who are passionately motivated by climate change, and that's why they work here. But we also have people here who want to build the biggest machine in the world and have this amazing piece of kit to do fantastic science, or they just want to do really great plasma physics, and that's okay. That's fine. That's a perfectly good, very strong motivator. Fine, it takes everyone. So.
Yeah. I try not to get too nerdy on these conversations, which is difficult because I'm a nerd about technology, and we have some weird and wonderful technologies and companies on. Robert, you obviously we've known each other a while and share some sort of mutual conversations and clients in the background. How would you see the difference between, from an investor perspective, investing as you did relatively early on in First Light Fusion and a fusion technology versus some of the other companies in which you invest, which are more further along the sort of technology readiness level? How have you found working alongside Nick and supporting for your investment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say First Light sits at one end of our portfolio. Having said that, it's the company where I've had the most engagement internationally and from kind of the UK government. Right. So this area is something of particular strength in this country, and we'll maybe go into that in a minute. It's strategic for the UK and actually for other countries that we're talking to. When we talk a bit more about the value of large thermal plants in grids, but this science, in terms of developing fusion science and the potential of this technology, for us, it sits a bit alongside things like quantum computing and general computer intelligence as a kind of fundamental scientific endeavor. We are not scared of science risk. We have sort of evergreen capital and a lot of understanding in the team. So it's the sort of business that we can invest in. The timescales are long, but the significance of the technology is very great. And maybe a final point is, Nick mentioned some of the people that he has in the team, and I've sort of been privileged to meet many of them. Just the level of talent that companies like First Light attract is jaw-dropping. It reminds me a bit of that film Good Will Hunting. They have several people like that who just do equations for fun. I mean, there are genius level people all over that company. So it's an extraordinary business. The timescales are very long, but the impact is potentially massive. Yeah.
Well, let's look at that, because this year there've been some fairly interesting announcements, obviously with sort of that point of ignition where energy out is greater than energy, and which perhaps you can share a little more about. But what's been fascinating since we've been talking more recently is the amount of private investment and private startups who are making an impact, when there clearly has been and continues to be quite a bit of government money into sort of ITEL and other sort of places where this technology is being sort of brought forward. But it does seem to be that now there's a lot of startups, there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of companies who you would think it's not a natural playground, because it is a long-term play and it's obviously quite capital intensive. So Nick, perhaps you can share a little bit how you differ from some of the other fusion startups out there at the moment, both from in terms of technology and where you are in your journey so far.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to start, I'll sort of compare and contrast pursuing something like this in a private setting versus in a public setting. And I mean, clearly the private setting is able to move much quicker, obviously. And it comes down to boring but very simple things like procurement rules and so on, and risk tolerance, right? So private sector fundamentally can go faster. Why are we seeing so much investment in fusion now when this bill still been, when it has been historically a public sector endeavor? I would kind of say that now it's within range, and it's kind of the trajectory for the public sector isn't what matters. It's how quickly will it take the private sector to take it from where it is to functioning technology. Yeah. And I like I say, when I say in range, can you do that and deploy a plant on the grid in 10 to 15 years time? And I think the answer is yes, absolutely. There are a lot of approaches to fusion, and it's one of the things I find remarkable. It's kind of it's I would say the hardest problem out there. Yet there are so many solutions, and they all look so different to each other. Right. And they're all attracting a lot of funding, both private and public. And I think that is the case because there is not going to be just one solution. There are many viable ways to address fusion and get to a power producing technology. And it's too soon to call it, you know. So there are 3, 4, 5 different approaches, all with very good prospects, and we don't know at the moment which is going to be the lead, I suppose, or the first, or the most important. What we are seeing now is, and again from private investors and also from governments, is a little bit of a scramble to invest more into inertial fusion. And because of the result last year. So the physics case for inertial fusion is now absolutely dead clear. It definitely works. It's been proven that it works. Yeah. I've already heard of 2 new startups since that result. There's been a German program, 90 million euros from Sprint announced, and I think there's going to be more of that throughout the course of this year.
I was going to add from the capital side. So in addition to what Nick was talking about in terms of you can now see the route. All this government work has created this amazing scientific foundation and trained a lot of people. And so Nick said, what you need to do now is maybe it's more an engineering challenge, although it's hard. The other piece that's driven a lot of the private sector investment has really been the concept of net zero and significantly larger amounts of capital available to back new climate technologies.
Right.
So we regard sort of 2018, the IPCC report, 1.5 degrees as kind of ground zero for the concept of net zero. When you run the numbers on the global energy system, there just is a need for a sort of large thermal technology like this. It could, of course, be fission, but fission seems to be going up in cost in most places. So if you really care about climate change and you're serious about net zero, there's a gap in the overall system for something like this.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the tens of billions of venture capital that have been raised in the last 3 or 4 years, where they're looking quite strategically, a lot of these new funds, they'll look hard at nuclear and as fusion as we think more venturable side of nuclear, given there are new technologies being developed in fusion. And the opportunity for an IP-rich business is much greater on the fusion side of things. So it's also around real commitment to action on climate change.
Yeah, sometimes I think we're in some ways a perfect storm, as much as obviously with what's going on in climate it's the opposite of that, but a perfect storm in the sense of, I should say, both policy, investment, the amount of money now recognizing what needs to be done and is coming in. I think it was 4 or 5 billion I saw invested in fusion startups in the last 4 or 5 years, which is significant. Nick, picking up on your last point, because I was intrigued when you look at the likes of what SpaceX achieved versus what NASA achieved, and just looking at innovation, and you touched on there, obviously you have the advantages as a private sector company of speed and sort of less procurement rules and regulations. But is there something deeply missing or more innovative within the startup communities that you, and obviously other founders who I'm sure you're aware of, and some of those large scale public sector projects which are still ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious compare and contrast between NASA and SpaceX is that NASA won't dare blow up a rocket.
Right.
It's just not in the culture. It's just not the way they think, that they're going to they'll do the mission and then they'll try and land it. And if it doesn't, well, we learn lots of stuff. And there is a difference there, because fusion and SpaceX do get compared a lot. But SpaceX was launching satellites, and so it was getting paid for their development by launching satellites. That's how they could afford to blow up a rocket. They'd already done the job with the rocket. It was now a spare rocket that was falling down to Earth, right? So that is a difference. And it was TRL-9 technology, the actual launching the satellite, right? Yeah. So that's different. Within fusion, I mean, what I would say is absolutely crucial or the crucial enabler for First Light is the simulations and the ability to simulate the problem. Mm-hmm. So we got to a demonstration of fusion with our approach for the first time in the end of 2021, and we announced it April last year, about a year ago.
Yeah.
There was 100,000 simulations that went into that effort. And our general run rate is that we're doing 4,000 or 5,000 simulations per experiment that we do. Mm-hmm. So that allows us to make so much more rapid progress, because although our CFO is very unhappy about our electricity bill, it's a lot cheaper to do the simulation than it is to do the experiment.
Yeah. Just picking up on, again, the point you made there, Nick, around there are a number of fusion paths, if you like, to solving the problem. Perhaps you can share a little bit more about the First Light Fusion technology, because I first saw, I think it was Bart Marcus did a presentation, who's one of your early investors, presentation, I think in Berlin, looking at the sort of the ballistics and having a bit of a presentation on how the technology works. So perhaps you can share a little bit exactly on how fusion works from a First Light Fusion perspective and how that differs perhaps from some of the other technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working on a new method for inertial fusion. So the core process in inertial fusion is that there's an implosion. So you implode a fuel pellet. So you squash the fuel pellet at very, very high velocity, and that heats up the contents and compresses it, and that's what you need for fusion. So our process is exactly the same as the process on the National Ignition Facility, which is demonstrated again. It's a spherical implosion of the fuel pellet. But the key thing is that we can realize that spherical implosion with a different system. So instead of using the big laser, which is very expensive, and it's hard to see how you'd engineer that into a power plant, although it's not impossible, we use a high velocity projectile. It has a much cheaper, much simpler system. And the trick is that the key technology turns the one-sided impact from the projectile into that spherical implosion of the fuel capsule. That's what we call our amplifiers.
Yeah.
So the amplifier design is the key thing which we have, which no one else in the world has ever developed before, which is the foundation of our approach.
Maybe, David, to pick up on your question around how startups differ from the federal labs, this idea of focusing shockwaves and harnessing a low-cost, high-efficiency driver, so the projectile launcher, to achieve the sort of proven physics of inertial confinement, just would have struggled to get traction in the big government labs. So it's sort of way off the mainstream. It needed an entrepreneurial environment to really try it out and take some risk. Because it's conceptually hard that the sort of beautiful thing you get from a $4 billion laser with 192 beams could be simulated with a much cheaper bit of kit that's driving from one side. We've had the First Light approach described in The Economist as the most radical, new way of thinking about fusion engineering.
Right.
And for us as an investor, when we look at sort of backing these things, we're always looking for the most distinctive approach. As Nick's described, it's not just inertial fusion, which is the one that's got gain. It's a sort of a new way into inertial fusion that's much lower cost and much more efficient than the laser-driven approach.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. And I assume it's still live, in which case we'll point people on the episode page to some examples or where they can see more about the technology in action, or at least the demonstrators in action. Share both, if you would, a little bit of the impact of fusion, because we all know that we need to decarbonize, but we also know that the amount of data and the amount of electrification that we need is increasing the actual energy demand, or will continue to increase. So firstly, how big an impact do we think fusion can make in terms of the overall energy requirements for a future society? And I guess the $1 million question is how quickly, because I've read people quoting anywhere between 10 and 100 years before we have properly commercialized fusion plants. So perhaps you can take a view on those two aspects.
I think Nick's referring a little bit to my role as a commissioner on the Energy Transitions Commission. So part of that work is to look at the overall transition. And we, as part of First Light work, have looked at their projections and had some of the people who created their overall projections involved in thinking through the business plan for First Light. The vision that the ETC puts forward for how you actually practically and cost effectively achieve net zero is electrification led. So approximately today, we have 30,000 terawatt hours of electrical power being produced, and still, unfortunately, mostly using fossil sources. So only about 5,000 terawatt hours of that is wind and solar. That needs to completely invert and grow dramatically. So we need to go from the 30,000 terawatt hours we have today to more than 100,000 terawatt hours by 2050.
Yeah.
And if you add on hydrogen and ammonia and carbon removals by direct air capture, it's more like 130,000 terawatt hours. Most of that could and should be from wind and solar, which are at scale, and there's a huge resource globally for both those two proven renewables technologies.
Yeah.
But if you look at the most optimistic projections for how rapidly we will deploy wind and solar, you don't get to 130,000 terawatt hours. It's just not possible given planning constraints, grid constraints, supply chain constraints. And from when we first published the 100,000 terawatt hours back in 2019, we're well off the pace. So the rate at which we have to deploy wind and solar has gone up further. In addition to a real concern about just there being enough energy from those two sources, having these big thermal plants. So, fusion plant make heat fundamentally, and that gets turned into power with spinning generators on grids has real benefits for the cost effectiveness and resilience of those grids. So there's the whole rotating inertia thing, but just in terms of managing a grid with diverse resources in terms of wind and solar changing all the time. If you just look at the UK energy system, the nuclear that we have today is incredibly valuable. And so when we talk to government policymakers, even for countries like, say, the US, which is hugely blessed with renewables resources, they are planning to have significant nuclear going forward. It just adds resilience and diversity to the system. So we think there is a big need for sort of complementary large thermal plant of some form of nuclear. And when you look at fission, the exception of China, it seems to be getting relatively more and more expensive, unlike all the other technologies. They're all getting cheaper batteries, wind, solar, etc. And there's a lot of quite reasonable public opposition to fission. And if you look at the Fukushima disaster, which at last cost something like $200 billion cost to the Japanese economy. So there are real issues with fission. And people just aren't building the plant. Hinkley is being massively delayed in this country. So there's a real need in terms of net zero for a new, clean, call it baseload power supply. And at the same time, we have significant advances in the technology that Nick mentioned, including the availability and application of digital tools. So there are a couple of mega trends that all these startups can benefit from in things like our ability to manage plasmas and understand them and actually model them.
Yeah.
So that the way towards fusion power now looks much more straightforward than it did even sort of 10 years ago. And the need has really come into focus in terms of, we need a complement to renewables.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. Nick, perhaps we can turn to you in a slightly different frame then, because something Robert picked on there was, again, about safety issues, and nuclear can be quite a divisive topic, and a lot of people will cite to Fukushima and Chernobyl and other sort of safety issues, and as much as the cost issues. Perhaps you can share with us a little bit about fusion technology in terms of how that differs, and obviously how much more safe it is than traditional fission and nuclear that we've had for many years.
Yeah, sure. And let's say the straightforward things first, just to be absolutely clear. So there is no meltdown risk with a fusion power plant. You interrupt the process because a tsunami, it just stops. You have to put so much effort in to get it going. If you interrupt it, it's done. There's also no high-level waste, and there's also no long-lived radioactive waste, which is a distinction which I'll make, and neither of either. And there's also no weapons-grade material, so you can't break into a fusion power plant, steal some unusual metal, and make something very unpleasant. Now that's the simple answer, right? So it's much better than fission on those fronts.
Yeah.
There is nuclear waste though. There is radioactive waste from fusion, and that's important not to gloss over, because if we don't talk about that openly and honestly, then the public are going to discover that fact, and that's going to be a bad thing. And actually, I think that this is going to be one of the big differentiators between fusion approaches. If we sort of wind forward to the 2040s, like which of these three finally successful technologies am I going to build? Well, possibly the one which produces the lowest level of waste.
Right.
And some approaches to fusion, you mentioned ITER before, actually would produce no high-level waste, but they would actually produce more intermediate-level waste than an existing nuclear plant.
Okay.
Actually 10 times more it could be. So that's not a good thing. Whereas our approach, based on our understanding at the moment, which is very embryonic, but it's borderline whether we have any intermediate-level waste at all. It might only be low-level waste. So there's big differences between fusion technologies on this important matter.
Those are interesting points, and I think, Robert, perhaps does that impact on, because whilst you won't hear governments, particularly those who are attempting to build nuclear power plants, fission plants, talk about safety issues in an open way, but do you think the significant advantages of fusion from not creating these weapons-grade materials, from not having the same levels at least of nuclear waste, and obviously the meltdowns that we have seen a couple of times in my lifetime at least, do you think that's impacting on the support that you're seeing and you've touched on in terms of the push towards fusion and the making of the environments for us to pursue these technologies?
Yes, actually it is. It's been interesting. As I mentioned earlier, this is the investment we've had, where we've had the most engagement from mostly the UK government, but also some other governments, given its strategic nature. So early on, and we were the first investor in First Light, we'd highlighted this regulatory risk. We really wanted to get our heads around what might the processes be to approve a fusion power plant. And actually with a lot of really great advocacy from Nick, who's been into Whitehall probably 20 or 30 times to talk to people, we have a very good ongoing dialogue with the UK government. And there's already been a decision that there would be a new regulator for fusion power in the UK.
Okay.
So separating it out from the people who regulate the fission approach, who are very rigorous, but we've seen the regulation associate with very high costs. So that's encouraging, and it reflects a perception amongst political decision makers that this technology could be very important for net zero and also strategically very important. And that's also been the case in other countries. So same in the US and in Asia as well. We see people regarding this as strategic, making plans for it, looking at resources like lithium, which for most fusion processes, you need lithium to create part of the fuel. And there are actual policy documents in countries with lithium deposits around fusion applications. So it's being taken quite seriously. And we see that the message around this is a safer, than fission approach, sort of landing with policymakers.
Right.
And that's important because that feeds directly into cost for fusion. If it is regulated exactly the same as nuclear, it's going to cost basically the same as nuclear. So it needs to be regulated proportionate to the actual risk level, which is much less.
Right.
And if you dig into the costs for nuclear, like why is it so expensive? It's just everything. It's like you can't have one security fence. You have to. You can't have a backup diesel. You can have a backup diesel generator, but HPC has a backup diesel generator for the backup diesel generator in case that one fails. So it's just it's everything.
Everything's multiplied. I think I was on a walk near Sellafield not so long ago and was approached by a number of gentlemen with machine guns, and so all of those implications as well of I guess are additional costs. Moving back to something again, I think you touched on there, Robert, is around the UK in this respect, because again there's a lot of. It's easy to point it in the past. The UK has been great for innovation, but then technologies tend to get commercialized in the US or APAC or elsewhere. But it sounds like there's a good UK support for what you're doing. How is the UK, particularly again more recently, we've seen things like the IRA supporting greener technologies in the US, and obviously the EU coming up with the Green Deal Industrial Plan or variation on that. How are you finding the UK support? It sounds like it's positive, but how is it doing business in the UK as a fusion startup?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure Nick looks some views as well. It's pretty good. Let's look at the history. The UK actually was the first to commercialize nuclear. So in the 50s, it was really our idea to take this weapons technology and try and use it for civil power generation purposes. And phrases like too cheap to meter, these are all from British early nuclear efforts. So we have a decent sized fleet, and they really date from then up until the 70s. And then there was a moratorium when all this cheap natural gas came through, in the 80s. So we did do some good commercialization, and we are benefiting from that existing fleet. They do a lot of good work in the current energy system. We then decided to stop looking at nuclear, and it wasn't just us, it was people in the US as well, and really the focus moved to Asia. So we've now lost most of that skills base around fission. There are some good university activities, nothing compared to what we're seeing in Asia. So there is a bit of a recognition in government that we're not necessarily wanting to back winners, certainly with the current government, but areas where we have an advantage are worth investing in. So offshore wind would be one. And really, as a residue of that early nuclear fission work, we have an entity called the UK Atomic Energy Authority. They only do fusion now. And it's actually the world's largest fusion organisation based south of Oxford. And around UK AEA, so the Culham Centre for Fusion Energy, are now a cluster of startups, including First Light. So in a very quiet, understated way, we've created what we think is the largest fusion hub in the world. if you set aside ITER, which is a huge construction project in the south of France, in terms of engineering and scientists developing new approaches, this part of Oxfordshire is just a global hub, and politicians do recognise that. You bring them onto the Culham site, and you can see these startup activity, JET, which until recently held the world record, as evidence that we're pretty good at this. And in the sort of in 2023, skills actually are almost at the rate limiting step.
Right.
And there are a huge number of people who've been working on fusion for more than a decade in this country, and that creates again the centre of gravity. So we've been pretty encouraged by the recognition of that advantage. There is some funding. A lot of it goes via UK AEA, and certainly First Light is in active conversation with the UK government. In terms of scale and scope of something like the Inflation Reduction Act, in general, the UK has not been great.
Yeah.
And I don't think we are planning to rely on that. If you're sitting in this country, we just don't have, $200 million DOE grants for startups. So one has to sort of box a bit clever. But things like access to all that infrastructure and expertise at UKAEA, access to sites, grid connections, these things are very helpful.
Yeah.
And there are a number of other European countries, let's say Italy, for example, which is a similar size economy to the UK. You just couldn't do the stuff in that country. There's some activity in Germany, but again, the UK is better really fundamentally for fusion than Germany. So it's a good foundational set of capabilities and infrastructure. The government is supportive, but really our job, and this is something Nick and I are working on, is to pull in private sector funding to actually do the bulk of the heavy lifting in terms of taking these companies forward.
I mean, I agree with everything Robert said, but I will just add to it by pointing out a fact, which is that the funding ratio between magnetic fusion and inertial fusion in this country is 100-1 in favour of magnetic fusion. So we do get some benefit from all of that investment because UK AEA are some of the world leaders in magnetic fusion and also some of the world leaders in some of the engineering challenges which we have to solve as well.
Yeah.
So nevertheless, the funding ratio is 100-1 for inertial fusion, and it's inertial fusion that now has the existence proof that the physics definitely works.
Yeah.
So I hope we see an expansion of the inertial fusion program in this country.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so for any number of reasons. And again, perhaps get your take as both an investor and as a founder that we've seen in our capacity at Hyperion that there have been a number of startups, particularly those with high capital costs, who've been tempted to go across the pond because of the IRA and other supporting acts and finances and talent, actually, which again you touched on as having a core of talent in the UK, which is brilliant. But again, we are seeing there's a little bit of a brain drain that's been affected by that. Are there any temptations could you accelerate what you're doing by opening establishments or sharing that technology outside of the UK?
Well, I mean, it comes up very frequently, as you'd expect, and it's kind of a question of when, not if. We take some presence in the US. At the moment, we are finding that the most productive path forward is to collaborate with institutions in the United States, rather than to think about going over there. We are very collaborative as an organization. If we just sort of talk about talent, you can find great experienced people from the national labs, but it's different. The skills and abilities of that person is different. If you take them out of the lab and move them to a different country and different different place, and it's extraordinarily expensive. National labs pay extremely well,
right?
So. Yeah, we're pursuing a collaboration approach, I would say, at the moment. Okay, cool. So coming back to a point of the expectations and the sort of the journey ahead, Nick, for the next few years for First Light Fusion and perhaps then more broadly fusion. What are the next key milestones? We've seen, as you say, recently that point of net gain. What are the next milestones, and what can we expect to see or hope to see from First Light Fusion over the next, say, 3, 4, 5, 10 years? Yeah, so our next phase is to build our own gain demonstrator. So we are strongly encouraged by the result from the National Ignition Facility.
Yeah.
It's made a big difference to the risk profile, but we don't believe we get to skip a step. We still believe it is incumbent on us to demonstrate gain with our own technology and our own approach. What the DPhil has done, though, is given us real confidence to bring the design of the pilot plant in parallel with that gain demonstrator.
Okay.
So the objective now is to get to demonstrating gain with our approach and to get to the conceptual design of a pilot plant, ready to start the front-end engineering and design, ready to start the feed process, and ready to have wet-end signatures on a joint venture, for example, to actually build it. To try and do it in parallel to bring the timescales in.
And as I understand, you're looking at, or not necessarily say licensing the technology, but not to actually build plants yourself, but to obviously utilize and provide the technology and work with partners and to evolve the actual factories, essentially, who will be producing the electricity. Is that correct? So I think some more fusion companies, from what I've seen, are actually looking to actually build, operate, and maintain plants.
Some are talking about, yes, building and operating, and some SMR companies, some nuclear companies, startups, I think, are talking about building and operating. I think that's one difficulty level. Then there are others talking about building and shipping almost. You have a factory built unit for fusion or for nuclear, and then it's operated by someone else. And that's another difficulty level, which I think is less. And then what we are talking about for our technology, yes, there will be technology which is licensed into the building of the power plant. And we will be involved in the building of the first plants because we'll need to transfer knowledge to the partners to do them. But our mission is solving the problem of fusion with the simplest machine possible. So we really want to design a technology which can be built by any large competent engineering company. And our business model is supplying the target, the thing the projectile hits. So we supply the fuel to the operators of the power plant. And then our destiny is to become a kind of precision manufacturing organization, which we think is a much more tractable business model for a small company.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense. Okay.
Yeah, as an equity investor, that makes us much happier for obvious reasons.
Rob? One of your rules is you don't invest in a technology that you can't pick up in your hand. Is that it?
Yeah. Human size, well, as it gets much bigger than a human, it's as an actual product, that starts to get really hard as an equity investor. I came back to this point of fusion versus fission. There are these technology-led approaches. So, in the business model that Nick describes, the targets that do the magic of turning the sort of dumb projectile impact into this beautifully focused compression is where all the technology, all the IP resides. Do that and let other people who are much better at building large plant do the rest of it, and keep all those huge assets off your equity funded startup's balance sheet.
Yeah, that does make sense. So we've covered quite a bit, and I appreciate both of your time. But again, let's look at where you feel, in a good case scenario, we'll first start to see fusion-powered electrons onto a grid, whether that's in the UK or elsewhere in the world.
So I think that we are going to see pilot plants multiple in the 2030s. And I think we will see the first proper commercial plants perhaps at the very end of the 2030s or into the 2040s. And I think if that comes to pass, we're going to see a dash of fusion and a mass, as many as we can build, push in the 2040s.
Robert, your take?
Yeah, I think that's a good time scale. We have tended to find that our companies, we invested in about 48 now clean energy hardware companies. We have this benefit of having sort of evergreen capital. So I think that's a good time scale. We're not too concerned about the time scale per se, because the confidence we have around the market is there. So we invested in carbon capture in 2011. We invested actually in fusion in 2011. So I think the point for us is have the best technology. Things will happen, pandemics and wars and all these type of things. So I think we tend not to commit to particular timescales. The thing we're looking at in terms of managing a company or managing our shareholding in a company like First Light is the company continuing to do world-class IP value creation. And if that's the case, you're building value. So I think Nick's planning for those timescales would be give up if it delays a bit. No, I think the point is that we think this is going to be one of the largest entirely new markets to be created in the transition, and we've obviously got a big exposure to that in our shareholding in First Light.
Yeah, I think because of the size of the prize, as you sort of indicated there, you starting to feel that there are other deep tech private investors who are taking the longer term views, as IP Group and obviously now Kiko Ventures have as you say, had that knowledge that this is a long term play.
We see lots of private money. There's some really good people who moved into the space, and some less experienced people who moved into the space. And actually, and this is generic, I think as clearly there's a general sort of macroeconomic headwinds are an issue right now. We're in a post Silicon Valley Bank world, which is going to affect. It's going to leach into climate tech in the next couple of years. So the challenge for those of us in the community is to maintain the belief these solutions are needed and valuable, even though we're going to see some casualties. There's phrases like there's going to be a Theranos in some of these battery chemistry companies. There probably is, and we've seen it before in the late 2000s. So part of the thing we want to communicate is these technologies are good. Mostly the people working on them are very, very talented. And as we move into concerns around cost of energy and let's go and do more fracking or more North Sea oil and gas, the sort of grinding inevitability of needing to act on climate change just really is there.
Yeah.
So there'll be a choppy few years, we think. Some of the investors who've invested in Fusion get that, and they've been around for a while, and others don't. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to sort of keep the big picture, which is a multi-decade picture, in focus as we go through what's probably going to be a bit of a choppy period.
I would just add the same thing which I always add when people ask about investment timescales and Fusion, which is that, it's not going to be an investment for everyone, but one of our investors is a pension fund, and the average age of their pensioners or will be pensioners, they told me was 37. So they really, really are investing on a 30-year time frame, and there's plenty of money out there with similar philosophy.
And just in closing, Nick, obviously money is fundamentally important to any startup, and it's great that you have people like Robert on your side, and I'm sure it does take a lot of your time. But back to yourself as an entrepreneur and as a PhD, what part of your job do you enjoy the most?
Definitely talking to the team about technical stuff. Sorry, Rob, it's not the investor side of it.
Getting good and nerdy. Good. So listen, thank you both very much for your time. We'll point on the episode page for the podcast to various places where they can see more of First Light Fusion and some more resources for people to do more. And of course, you can reach out to those organizations for more information. But it's great to have the conversation. It's good to be looking at some really meaningful long-term technologies. As somebody that's been in the cleantech space for pushing 15 years or so, it's great to see things that have evolved, because way back when I started, solar was laughed at, let alone fusion, and it's good to see the progress we've made, and thank you both for your efforts in all of that. So thanks for joining us. Best luck to First Light Fusion. We'll share the information readily, and hope and look forward to seeing more milestones along the way.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, thanks so much.